All right, well, good afternoon and welcome back to this week's edition of Table Talk. It's good to have you back with us. This week we are in Unit 9. It's Luke 7, verses 1 through 17, and that's going to be page 82 in your Certainty Study Guide and Sermon Guide. And this week at the table, Pebbles Forbus.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the table, but also welcome back to the country.
Yes.
Where have you been the past few months?
The months of January and February, I was in Albania. I was serving with YWAM, Youth with the Mission. So I completed a discipleship Bible school with them, and then we did a 2-month overseas outreach.
Oh, fantastic. Did you use the Bible school content in your mission, or was it sort of cumulative, everything? Or
Yeah, sometimes. So I was given the opportunity to preach in churches there and actually in a prison when I got to tell them the gospel message, which was amazing.
Oh, wow. Well,
Yeah.
Pebbles, there's so many questions. And I know many of you do, and we're probably going to hear a lot of that over the next several months. You're going to be working with the youth here for the summer. So we'll be hearing those stories, and we look forward to it. So thank you, and thank you for joining us just really upon your return.
Of course.
And so this week also we have Pastor Andrew Wild.
Glad to be here.
Now, again, don't check your devices. You don't have to worry about that. Pastor David gave the message yesterday, this weekend, but you're sitting in for David today.
I'm in his chair.
So that means that means the hot chair. That means you get to questions.
All right.
We got a good question, a viewer question out there too. So before we get into that question and kind of look at this passage, we're in this Luke 7, 1 through 17, where there are these two healings that Jesus performs, and they really carry with them some significant theological implications, a deeper message. Before we look at it, any first sort of insights or ahas or, wow, I didn't think about that until I heard this or read this? Pebbles.
I think my biggest thing is I really like that Jesus marveled at the centurion's faith. Yeah. That's my biggest thing.
Yeah. Does that surprise you or?
Yeah, for sure. Because it makes me want to ask myself, how can I make Jesus marvel? How can I use my faith to make Jesus marvel? Yeah.
I think you read my notes.
Really?
Oh, that's good. Okay. Andrew, how about you?
I think for me, David did a great job just anticipating a question that kind of often arises in my mind as I go through this, when the centurion says, "For I too am a man set under authority." And, how come he didn't say, "Hey, I'm one in authority"? So just the fact that the centurion is recognizing Jesus' relationship to the Father, and that really his authority is God's authority, and helping tease that out. That was a takeaway for me.
Yeah, no, that was good. And yeah, like I said, it's verse 9, Pebbles, where it says that, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. And I don't know if you caught, Pastor Beatty had said that there's really only twice that he's found, and I'm not sure of any other place, that Jesus marveled at someone or because of something. And it was the other end of the spectrum when he was in Nazareth, and it says, even his own town, he marveled at their unbelief. And so this is the other end. And, the same thing. I thought the same thing. I wonder, does my humility or my faith, would Jesus marvel at it?
Right.
Is it deep enough, rich enough, genuine enough that he would truly marvel at it? It is something I think to aspire to as well. So good word, good insight. So with that, would you read that passage for us?
I will.
Verse 17 would be great.
After he had finished saying all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built our synagogue." And Jesus went with him. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourselves, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning toward the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, and the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, do not weep. Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and the surrounding country.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Pebbles.
Yeah.
That is just so rich. So much going on there. And in that, so a lot of questions. One question from our viewer. Andrew,
Okay.
so you're sitting in for David here, and then Pebbles, you and I can take a stab at it too if we want. This was from our good friend and the good doctor, Ishmael.
He is a careful reader of Scripture.
He is a careful, and this is what's so great about this is that when we desire to be in Scripture so much that we do see the harmony of the Gospels, and we know what one Gospel says and what another Gospel says, and we ask questions, right?
Yeah.
So his question is, why does the account according to Matthew seem to indicate that Jesus is speaking directly to the centurion, while Luke's account records specifically that the centurion sent men to speak with Jesus? I count this as non-essential, but I am curious.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that is a great question, is it not? I mean, I hope that when I read, I'm able to detect differences like that. But so I want to applaud Ishmael for such careful study of the Scriptures, such a Berean there. Yes, there is a discrepancy there. And I'll just say that to me, in some ways, although my answer might be very satisfactory, I just want to say, it's assuring to me that there is a discrepancy. And I say that because if this was something that we were going to cook up, if we were going to sit around in the 2nd century or the 3rd century and say, hey, let's take the Jesus of the faith and let's turn him into the Christ of Christianity, and let's kind of embellish some of these things. Let's add some myth to it and blow this out of proportion. If we were doing that, we would sit down together in the study and we would iron out all these differences. We would hey, that yours is a little different from mine, so we got to smooth this over so there's more harmony here.
Yeah.
So the fact that there is a discrepancy leads me to believe that these are, this wasn't ironed out in the 3rd century. These are the historical documents that were written in the 1st century.
Yep.
In 2 different locations by people who just wanted to do an accurate representation of what happened. And this is my take on it.
Okay.
But my take is that even though Matthew is not prone to abbreviate, he's normally one to add details.
Right.
I think in this case, Matthew might have abbreviated. And in the same way that, the press secretary for the White House might issue a statement and people could say, well, the president said. In the same way that these individuals going on behalf of the centurion, Matthew could abbreviate and just say the centurion said. And I think we even see a little bit of that in Luke 7 when, if you get to this where he says, I'm looking at verse 9 now. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. Now, who's he marveling at? The actual centurion isn't there according to Luke.
Right.
It's his messengers.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus is still marveling at the centurion. So I see Matthew maybe more abbreviating and just giving a condensed account. And it was such that the representatives were speaking on his behalf that he could say the centurion was saying these things.
Yeah.
That's what is your thought?
Well, I think what's sort of comforting to me is that there's this, when we first look at it, our initial thought is, these aren't even the same thing. And then we step back. We say, okay, what possibly, let's put ourselves back into a first century perspective and get ourselves out of ours. And then at the end of the day, there's a number of ways this is actually very much in harmony. A couple of those ways seem to be possibly the sequencing. In other words, Matthew says that he says to the centurion, he sort of moves past the group conversation and goes straight to the final conversation and just didn't find to his audience that was necessary. He wanted to show, more emphasis on the centurion. Luke wanted to demonstrate sort of the interaction between the Jewish elders and their respect for this individual. The other is proximity. Basically it says that as he drew near him as well, Luke even says that as he was not far from the house, that there's this aspect or understanding that, this could even be like out in the front yard, that the centurion is saying, hey, you don't come under my roof because you will be unclean. I know that much. And there's almost like I'm talking through these 3 or 4 guys and they're just like 10 feet between me and you, Jesus, right? That there was still that humility that he still felt he had to go through, but yet Jesus could speak straight to him. He would verbally and audibly hear that. And then the other is just the like you said, I think I went back to like in my past career. I thought, okay, one of the things I really enjoyed because I really was blessed to work with and partner with a couple of labor unions, and you work through the negotiations and the annual deals, and every 3 years or every 5 years, and it was very common. I thought, that I would go back and I said, well, what did you tell them? Well, I told the employees that we could give something on the benefits, but we'd have to do something on the compensation. I never told the employees that. I worked through this negotiating committee, and they went back and told the employees that. But my language was exactly as Luke's is here. And so you start, I think there's some of that as well. So I think at the end of the day, we don't know for sure.
Yep.
But we do know that Matthew and Luke, being inspired, recorded the events that were important for their readers to hear, and that they were certainly in harmony. It was the same event.
I do think it was the same event,
yes,
too.
I
Especially
think so.
because there's a similar event in John chapter 4.
Okay.
But it's with a son and not a servant. And I think that might be a different event. I think this is the same event. And they both have it almost immediately after the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, whatever you want to call it, is where this is in the chronological sequence of events.
What do you think, Pebbles?
Yeah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Matthew would have been an account from Matthew, and Luke would have been an account of many eyewitnesses. And Luke was a doctor, so I would imagine Luke being like interviewing someone like, okay, how did you see this story? And like asking questions and maybe pulling out more details to the account where Matthew would have just been saying what he wanted,
Yeah. What I recall is Jesus healed the centurion's servant, and he told the centurion, your faith, and Luke is sort of, that's right. It's kind of gathering that too. Yeah, very good. End of the day, I agree with Dr. Goko. There's a non-essential aspect to it.
That's right.
But it's an important, process activity for us, because you have people who will point and say, contradiction. You can't believe anything, right? And it's just not true, right? That's just misusing that. Well, good. So, speaking of Centurion, we move on. And, when I think of Centurion, I do think of Captain Wild here. This is in this story. I come to the table and I think of, I guess, can you still be called Captain Wild?
No, I think you have to be actually retired to keep your rank. So I think.
Okay. All right. Well,
just having resigned the commission doesn't allow you to hold on to that title anymore.
In my mind, had we been in first century Palestine, I think he would have been a centurion soldier for sure. But the insight I think is important, because we're going to see this throughout. Again, the Gospels, we're going to see it in Acts. The idea, what is a centurion? David said, over 100 soldiers, plus or minus. That was kind of the rank. And in our mind, we think, all right, battles, they earned their stripes, right? Unlike a lot of other leaders in the Roman Empire, they weren't positioned or commissioned based on their family or their social standing. It was like, hey, he's a great warrior. He earned his stripes here. Let's promote him. But yet there was little sort of battle opportunities at this point that we know of. And that the majority of all centurions were sort of street cops, beat cops. The sheriff's officer That's sort of the captain or the major or, that rank. And making sure the taxes get moved from the booth, to the collection place securely, right? A little bit of Brinks work there. Crucifixions, overseeing the crucifixions, so there a lot of tension, a lot of friction. And yet 3 centurions in Scripture we see come to a faith in Jesus. We see it here. Then we see it at the cross. We see it at the end of Mark.
Surely this man was the Son of God.
Surely this man was a centurion. And then we see it in Acts, and you remember who that is?
Cornelius.
Cornelius. What do you know about Cornelius?
He was the first Gentile saved.
It seems to be the case, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, at least through evangelism, right? The faith saved others, but that he heard the gospel, and he came to Christ. So, so you kind of get in our mind who this is, and it does seem here there's some good relations that are building between this. I mean, this guy helped them build a synagogue, right? So again, too often I think it's just like we saw when we looked at the Pharisees and the religious leaders. We just kind of put them all as like, that was the evil empire, right? Well, no, these were still humans. And we see this with the centurions and the Greeks and the Gentiles as well. And I think that's also the presence of Jesus and the impact of Jesus and crossing over into. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Centurion Wild, if we can call him that. I don't.
Well, let's go to the second pericope. Jesus has this encounter.
Yes.
With the widow. I almost get the sense that the funeral procession's going on, and they just kind of stumble upon things, and Jesus reaches out and he touches the bier. Yeah. And I wonder, this isn't a word we use very often. Maybe it's one to tuck away and we could pull it out for Scrabble, but other than that, it's not a word that comes up in our everyday vocabulary. So what was this, David? And why was touching it such a big deal? And was this intentional on Jesus' part, or was this just kind of a casual, nonchalant thing? And what's your thought on this? Yeah,
so and that's one of our questions in the study guides this week. So I hope that we kind of dig into that with the groups. But from my understanding, the bier, I think it's easy to say bier or beer, but the bier it's a combination of platform that the coffin or the body lays on and stand. But I in my mind, I kind of go to like how the ambulance units have those stretchers, and the legs pop out and you wheel it, and then they pop back in, and you and we still have that today with the hearse and the funeral, the coffin, what carries the coffin. So it was sort of the ceremonial platform. That's my understanding. I don't know if you have seen. That's
similar to, like you could use it as a stand, maybe before the body was going to go into the ground or into the tomb, or also used to transport,
to carry it
to the gravesite.
And so, regardless, because it was in contact with a dead body, then it itself also would have been ceremonially unclean. And you certainly could not touch that. I mean, there was certainly a restriction against that. And the message here, the emphasis here is that Jesus is impervious to that. He's not defiled, right? Otherwise, you would say he's defiled, but he's not defiled. And even further, it's almost like the teaching on the Sabbath. They point to him. You could point to him and say, wait, you're unclean. But then there's life. There's no longer death.
Right.
It's like, oh, wait. I guess he can't be defiled. Right? So I think that's just really the aspect of Jesus sort of overcoming both death, the authority of death, but also just he's not defiled, in the ways that religiously or that we might be, and he was demonstrating that. Any thought? Do you get that picture in your mind when you read that part?
Yeah.
The beer and
I like to imagine scripture, especially in the Gospels, and like seeing Jesus. So one of the schools I did in YWAM was actually memorizing 40% of Luke. So we memorized that story.
This passage here?
Yeah, the village of Nain. And so I like to try to imagine what like the people's faces were as they were, because they would have known that Jesus would have been considered unclean had he touched the body, So I'm imagining like what they're thinking, because there's great crowds with the woman and Jesus has his disciples with him too. So they're probably all like, what is he doing? But then he wakes up like the dead boy, comes back to life, and great fear swept the crowd. And they said God visited his people, so it shows God's authority through Jesus, like over even the dead.
Yeah.
And I think it, makes it, at the end it says, and they glorified God. So I think that it also shows like Jesus performs these miracles for people in order to give God glory.
Yeah. And that collective sort of gasp.
Yeah.
Like, when he touched it, you know, you know, he kind of pointing and talking, and what's going to happen, right? So I hope that's something that why touching it was a big deal. Why Luke recorded that, and you know why that kind of moved along the progression, because it easily could have just said, well, you know, she said he was dead, and he said come to life, and he did. But so it was his words, but also his touch was had authority. So I think that's great. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. I wonder too if he's bringing about a paradigm shift in terms of what makes one clean and unclean. And this is kind of,
about that too.
I like your point, but I wonder if in the background it's this idea, you know, like he tells the Pharisees later, like, oh, you guys watch the outside of the cup, when inside, you know, you can be full of greed and lust. And so this idea, it's what proceeds from the mouth, because that comes from the heart that makes one unclean. And he's trying to reorientate how people think about clean and unclean. Yeah.
We'll certainly start seeing that kind of that messaging come out more and more. So absolutely. So great two passages there. And so at our last look at Luke this week, one of the things I was thinking about was you've got several individuals, groups here. You have the centurion, you've got the Jews or the elders who came on behalf of the centurion. You have the widow, you have the widow's son, you know, who's dead and is alive. You have the people who got. Do any of those individuals or characters, when you read through this or hear it, do you just resonate with them? Do you say, "Oh, I'd like to know more about them," or "I can feel that," or anything in particular make you curious about any of those?
I mean, I think going back to the centurion and the word marvel, I think that's what, like, reading this section is the thing that stands out the most to me, and his faith. And he knew that, like, who Jesus was and the authority that he carried, and the trust that he had in his faith in the Lord. So it just makes me think, like, how can we today on earth make Jesus like marvel? What kind of faith makes the Lord marvel at us? So that's my takeaway.
That's a good one. Yeah, that's a good one. Andrew?
For me, it's when Jesus stumbles upon this scene and he sees the widow, and it just says he had compassion on her. I feel like I'm getting a fuller portrait of Jesus and who he is through that. And what just stands out to me is I almost get the sense that it's like he enters into this with her, and he's like, wow, that's her only son. There's no Social Security benefit. Maybe he's just thinking about what life would be like for this woman who's all alone now. Right. And he's just so, sometimes he did miracles because it's like, well, who sinned, this man or that? And it's like, well, no one. This happened so that the glory of God might be displayed. Yeah. And he does a miracle. It seems like here, he does the miracle just because he's so moved by this woman's plight. Yeah. He sees the pain, he sees the suffering, and he says, I'm going to step into this right now because this hurt is too much, and I'm going to bring life into this situation. And I think that's just a wonderful little foretaste of what all of us have to look forward to.
Yeah. No, that's good. For me, I think you touched on it earlier, but I sort of resonate with the people who were there. I like observing it all. And it says, that fear sees them seeing all these things. And then that they went away glorifying God and said that God has visited his people. And it kind of harkens back to in a way they're saying, Emmanuel, like God's with us. We don't know all the facts or what's going on exactly, but we know that God's in this. And I think I would, just kind of being in that crowd that day would be something I would have been impressionable, in fact, for sure, right, forever. Well, good. So, thank you, Pebbles, for joining us at the table this week. Andrew, thank you for filling in this week with David. And thank you for joining us. And until we see you next week at Table Talk, may we all, in this following week, grow in the knowledge of the power and the authority of the words of Jesus, and may they strengthen our faith as we do. Blessings, friends.